Picture this. A bulldozer sitting at the edge of a 150-year-old family garden, its engine rumbling ominously, while a woman in her 70s stands defiantly in front of it, holding nothing but a manila folder and decades of righteous fury. The HOA president is screaming from his Mercedes, demanding she move or face immediate legal action. But Margaret Chen isn't budging. Not today, not ever. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to witness one of the most shocking HOA power grabs I've ever encountered, and the brilliant revenge that followed. What started as a simple letter about property compliance would spiral into a 2-year legal battle that would expose corruption, fraud, and abuse of power that reached all the way to City Hall. By the time Margaret was done, 3 HOA board members would resign in disgrace, 1 would face criminal charges, and the entire neighborhood would never look at their monthly dues the same way again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a quiet retired teacher managed to bring down an entire corrupt HOA regime, we need to go back to where it all began, with a garden that held secrets the board never saw coming. Margaret Chen had called the modest Tudor-style home on Maple Grove Lane her sanctuary for 43 years. She'd raised 2 children there, nursed her husband through his final illness, and found solace in the sprawling garden that had been in her family since 1871. The property had been passed down through 5 generations of her family, each adding their own touches to the carefully cultivated landscape that now spanned nearly half an acre. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was historically significant. Her great-great-grandmother had planted the original heritage roses and fruit trees when the area was still farmland, decades before the suburban development sprouted around it. The stone pathways were laid by her grandfather during the Great Depression, using rocks quarried from the very land the neighborhood now occupied. Every plant, every tree, every carefully placed stone told a story of resilience, love, and family legacy. When the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was established in 1987, Margaret had been one of the founding members. Back then, it was a simple organization focused on maintaining common areas and organizing the annual block party. The monthly dues were reasonable, the rules were sensible, and the board members were neighbors who genuinely cared about preserving the quiet, family-friendly character of their community. But power, as Margaret would soon learn, has a way of corrupting even the most well-intentioned organizations. The trouble began when Richard Blackstone moved into the neighborhood in early 2019. Blackstone was a real estate developer who'd made his fortune flipping distressed properties and maximizing lot values. Within 6 months of moving in, he'd somehow maneuvered himself onto the HOA board. Within a year, he'd been elected president. The changes started small: new landscaping requirements for front yards, stricter guidelines about exterior paint colors, higher fines for violations. But Margaret noticed something troubling in the way Blackstone operated. Every new rule seemed designed to generate revenue for the HOA's rapidly expanding budget, and every contract for improvements went to companies that had mysterious connections to Blackstone's business network. The first red flag came when Blackstone proposed a neighborhood beautification initiative that would require all homeowners to replace their mailboxes with expensive designer versions available exclusively through a company owned by his brother-in-law. When several residents questioned the necessity and cost, Blackstone dismissed their concerns with thinly veiled threats about property values and community standards. But it was Blackstone's obsession with Margaret's garden that really set the stage for what was to come. He'd started making comments at board meetings about oversized landscaping and properties that do not conform to neighborhood aesthetics. Margaret knew he was talking about her garden, though he never mentioned her by name. You see, Margaret's property was unique in Willowbrook Estates. While every other home sat on standard quarter-acre lots with modest front and back yards, her corner property was nearly twice the size thanks to a quirk in the original subdivision plat from the 1960s. The developer at the time had been forced to work around her family's existing property rights, creating an irregularly shaped lot that extended well beyond the typical boundaries. The garden was visible from 3 different streets, and its mature trees and sprawling flower beds stood in stark contrast to the manicured uniform lawns that Blackstone seemed to prefer. More importantly, Margaret's property included a section that Blackstone had been eyeing for a different purpose entirely. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn, and you need to stick around because the corruption I'm about to reveal will absolutely shock you. Blackstone had been quietly working on a development deal that would transform the vacant lot adjacent to Margaret's property into a luxury townhouse complex. But there was one problem. The lot was too small to accommodate the profitable density he wanted, and the city's setback requirements meant he couldn't build as close to the existing homes as he needed to make the project financially viable. Unless, of course, he could somehow acquire a portion of Margaret's property to expand the developable area. Margaret first got wind of Blackstone's real agenda when she overheard him talking to another board member after a particularly contentious meeting about landscaping violations. He'd assumed everyone had left, but Margaret had lingered to clean up coffee cups and happened to be in the adjacent kitchen when she heard him say, "Once we get that old lady's garden cleared out, we'll have all the space we need for the access road." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The increasing scrutiny of her property, the vague threats about compliance, the new rules about excessive vegetation. It wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics at all. Blackstone was trying to force her to sell, or at least surrender a portion of her land, to facilitate his development project. But Margaret Chen hadn't survived 7 decades on this earth, including 30 years as a public school teacher dealing with difficult parents and administrators, to be intimidated by a small-time real estate developer with delusions of grandeur. She began documenting everything. Every comment at board meetings, every new rule proposal, every interaction with Blackstone or his allies on the board. She researched property records, HOA bylaws, and state regulations governing homeowners associations. What she discovered would eventually form the foundation of her counterattack. The Willowbrook Estates HOA, under Blackstone's leadership, had been systematically violating both their own governing documents and state law. They'd been awarding contracts without proper bidding processes, raising dues without required notice periods, and most damning of all, using HOA funds for purposes that directly benefited board members' business interests. But Margaret knew that exposing corruption would only work if she could survive the immediate threat to her property, and that threat was about to become very real, very quickly. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, delivered by certified mail with all the authority the HOA could muster. Margaret read the formal language with growing disbelief. Property non-compliance notice. Immediate action required. According to the letter, signed by Blackstone himself, Margaret's garden violated no fewer than 12 different provisions of the recently amended HOA covenants. Her heritage roses were excessive ornamental plantings that obstruct sightlines. Her fruit trees were non-conforming vegetation that attracts pests. Her stone pathways were unpermitted hardscape modifications. The list went on, each violation carrying a fine of $50 per day until corrected. The total penalties already exceeded $3,000, and Margaret had just 30 days to bring her property into compliance or face escalated enforcement action, including legal proceedings and lien placement. But here's what made Margaret's blood boil. She'd been present at every board meeting where these new rules were discussed, and she distinctly remembered objecting to several of them. More importantly, she'd kept meticulous notes showing that many of these violations contradicted rules that had been explicitly grandfather-claused for existing landscaping. Margaret immediately requested copies of the meeting minutes that should have reflected her objections. What she received was a sanitized version that bore little resemblance to what had actually been discussed. Her comments had been omitted entirely, and several key votes had been recorded as unanimous, when she clearly remembered significant opposition from other homeowners. This was when Margaret realized she wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. She was dealing with someone willing to falsify official records to achieve his goals. She wasn't about to let this slide. Margaret began attending every board meeting with a digital recorder, despite Blackstone's increasingly hostile attempts to limit public participation. She started requesting detailed financial records, forcing the board to acknowledge their legal obligation to provide them. And she began reaching out to other homeowners who she suspected were also being targeted by Blackstone's enforcement campaign. What she found was disturbing. At least a dozen other residents had received similar compliance notices, almost all of them for properties that happened to be located near Blackstone's planned development site. The pattern was clear. He was systematically targeting anyone whose property might impact his project, using the HOA's authority as a weapon to force compliance or financial hardship. But Margaret's investigation hit a roadblock when she tried to access the HOA's financial records. Blackstone claimed that providing detailed expense reports would be administratively burdensome, and offered only vague summary statements that raised more questions than they answered. When Margaret pressed for specifics about the contractors being used for neighborhood improvements, Blackstone became openly hostile. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. And you're going to want to stay with me because the lengths Blackstone went to silence Margaret will absolutely infuriate you. The harassment escalated dramatically over the summer of 2021. Margaret would come home to find HOA inspectors, who looked suspiciously like construction workers, taking photographs of her property from the sidewalk. Her mailbox was repeatedly vandalized with official-looking stickers declaring various violations. Anonymous flyers appeared in neighbors' mailboxes warning about problem properties that were driving down property values with thinly veiled references to Margaret's address. The daily fines continued to accumulate, despite Margaret's detailed written responses explaining why each alleged violation was either factually incorrect or contradicted established precedent. Blackstone refused to respond to her appeals, claiming she needed to follow proper procedures that seemed to change every time she tried to comply with them. By September, Margaret's accumulated fines exceeded $8,000, and she received notice that the HOA was preparing to place a lien on her property. This was the nuclear option. If upheld, it could force her to sell her home to pay the penalties, regardless of whether the underlying violations were legitimate. Margaret knew she needed legal help, but she also knew that Blackstone was counting on her being unable to afford a prolonged legal battle. A retired teacher's pension could only stretch so far, and hiring an attorney to fight the HOA would cost thousands of dollars she didn't have. That's when Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiring a lawyer immediately, she decided to become her own legal researcher. She spent weeks at the county law library, studying HOA governance law, property rights statutes, and administrative procedures. She filed public records requests with the county and city, seeking information about Blackstone's development plans and any permits or approvals that might be related to his project. What she discovered was a smoking gun that went far beyond simple HOA overreach. The county records showed that Blackstone had indeed applied for preliminary development approval for the townhouse project adjacent to Margaret's property. But the application contained architectural plans that showed an access road extending onto what appeared to be Margaret's land. When Margaret cross-referenced the survey markers, she realized that Blackstone's development plans were based on the assumption that he would acquire nearly a quarter-acre of her property. More damning still, the application had been filed 6 months before the HOA began targeting Margaret's garden with violation notices. This wasn't reactive enforcement. It was a premeditated campaign designed to pressure her into selling. But Margaret wasn't done digging. She'd noticed that several of the contractors hired by the HOA for recent neighborhood improvements had business addresses that seemed familiar. After some investigation, she discovered that they were all affiliated with companies in Blackstone's development network. The HOA had been paying inflated prices for services provided by Blackstone's business associates, effectively funneling homeowner dues into his personal sphere of influence. The smoking gun came when Margaret obtained copies of the checks written by the HOA treasurer. Several payments to these affiliated contractors had been authorized by Blackstone personally, despite clear language in the HOA bylaws requiring board approval for expenditures over $500. Even more suspicious, some of the services being paid for, like property assessment consulting, appeared to be directly related to Blackstone's development project rather than legitimate HOA business. Margaret now had evidence of self-dealing, falsified records, and what appeared to be outright theft of HOA funds. But she also knew that exposing this corruption would make her an even bigger target for retaliation. The situation reached a boiling point in November 2021 when Margaret received what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as a settlement offer. Blackstone, through the HOA's attorney, proposed to waive all accumulated fines and drop enforcement action against her property in exchange for her agreement to sell a portion of her land to a community land trust that would preserve it for neighborhood benefit. The proposal was dressed up in language about environmental conservation and community enhancement, but Margaret saw right through it. The land trust was another shell entity controlled by Blackstone, and the purchase price was far below market value. It was essentially legalized extortion. Comply with our demands or face financial ruin through endless legal battles and accumulating fines. Margaret's response was swift and decisive. She rejected the settlement offer and instead filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Commerce, which regulated HOA operations. She also began preparing her own legal offensive, armed with the evidence she'd painstakingly gathered over months of investigation. But Blackstone wasn't about to back down quietly. He'd invested too much time and money into his development project to let one stubborn homeowner derail his plans. His next move would be the most brazen yet, and it would ultimately be his downfall. The morning of February 15, 2022, started like any other for Margaret Chen. She was in her kitchen, enjoying her usual cup of tea while watching the sunrise illuminate her beloved garden, when she heard the rumble of heavy machinery outside her front door. Margaret rushed to her window and couldn't believe what she was seeing. A bulldozer was positioned at the edge of her property, its massive blade gleaming in the morning light. Behind it sat a dump truck and what appeared to be a paving crew. Standing beside the equipment, clipboard in hand, was none other than Richard Blackstone himself. Margaret threw on her coat and hurried outside, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. As she approached the group, Blackstone looked up with what she would later describe as a smug, self-satisfied expression. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, his voice carrying across the frosty morning air. "I'm glad you're here. We need to discuss the emergency maintenance work that's about to begin on your property." Emergency maintenance work. The audacity of the man was breathtaking. Margaret demanded to know what authority the HOA had to bring heavy equipment onto her private property without permission. Blackstone's response was chilling in its casual arrogance. He explained that the HOA had declared her garden a community safety hazard due to overgrown vegetation that allegedly blocked sight lines for emergency vehicles. As such, they were exercising their authority under the emergency provision of the covenants to immediately remediate the situation. The emergency provision was a legitimate clause in the HOA governing documents, designed to allow rapid response to genuine hazards like fallen trees blocking roads or structural damage that posed immediate danger to residents. But Margaret knew her garden posed no such threat. This was simply the latest escalation in Blackstone's campaign to force her compliance. What happened next would be seared into Margaret's memory forever. Blackstone signaled to the bulldozer operator, who started the engine and began moving toward her heritage rose bushes, the same roses her great-great-grandmother had planted 150 years earlier. That's when Margaret Chen did something that would become neighborhood legend. She walked directly in front of the bulldozer and sat down. Not stood. Sat down. Right there in the dirt, arms crossed, directly in the machine's path. The operator immediately shut off the engine, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Blackstone began shouting about trespassing and obstruction, threatening to call the police and have Margaret arrested. But Margaret just sat there, calm as could be, and pulled out her cell phone. She wasn't calling for help. She was live streaming. You see, Margaret had learned a few things about modern advocacy during her months of research. She'd set up social media accounts and connected with other homeowners who were fighting similar battles across the country. When she started broadcasting that morning, her modest following of neighborhood supporters quickly spread the word. Within minutes, Margaret's impromptu sit-in was being watched by dozens of people. Within an hour, the local news had been alerted. By noon, the story had gone viral on social media platforms, with the hashtag Save Margaret's Garden trending locally. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn, because Blackstone's reaction to the publicity would expose the full extent of his corruption in the most public way possible. Instead of backing down and trying to handle the situation quietly, Blackstone doubled down. He called the police, claiming that Margaret was trespassing on HOA common property and interfering with emergency maintenance work. When the officers arrived, they found themselves in the awkward position of trying to sort out a complex property dispute that was being broadcast live to a growing online audience. The responding sergeant, a patient man named Officer Rodriguez, asked both parties to explain their positions calmly. Margaret had her documents ready, property surveys showing the exact boundaries of her land, copies of the original HOA covenants, and most importantly, the evidence she'd gathered showing that Blackstone's emergency was fabricated. Blackstone's explanation became increasingly frantic and contradictory as he tried to justify the immediate need for demolishing a garden that had existed peacefully for decades. When Officer Rodriguez asked to see the official safety inspection that had identified the emergency hazard, Blackstone claimed it had been conducted verbally by a qualified professional. That's when Margaret delivered her knockout punch. She calmly pulled out her phone and showed Officer Rodriguez the county development record she'd discovered, explaining how Blackstone's townhouse project required access through her property. She then produced the financial records showing how HOA funds had been diverted to companies in Blackstone's business network. The livestream audience watched in real time as Officer Rodriguez's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to barely concealed outrage. He asked Blackstone directly whether he had any financial interest in acquiring Margaret's property. Blackstone's stammering non-answer told everyone everything they needed to know. But the most damning revelation came when Margaret revealed the piece of evidence she'd been saving for exactly this moment. Remember those falsified meeting minutes she'd discovered months earlier? She'd continued requesting official records from the HOA and had noticed that the pattern of alterations went far beyond just her own comments. Margaret had obtained copies of the original meeting recordings, the ones made before Blackstone edited the minutes, through a public records request filed with the county clerk's office, where the HOA was required to deposit certain official documents. When she compared the actual recordings to the official minutes that had been distributed to homeowners, the discrepancies were stunning. Entire discussions about spending limits had been omitted. Votes that had failed were recorded as passing. Most shocking of all, Margaret had discovered that several major expenditures had been approved in closed executive sessions that violated the state's open meeting requirements for HOA governance. As Margaret laid out this evidence to Officer Rodriguez, with hundreds of viewers watching the live stream, Blackstone's composure completely cracked. He began making threats about lawsuits and criminal charges, his voice rising to a near shout as he realized that his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling in the most public way possible. The crowd of supporters that had gathered during the morning continued to grow throughout the day. Neighbors who had been quietly suffering under Blackstone's enforcement campaign began sharing their own stories with the growing media presence. Other HOA board members, sensing which way the wind was blowing, started distancing themselves from Blackstone's leadership. By late afternoon, it became clear that this was no longer just about Margaret's garden. It had become a referendum on HOA abuse of power and corruption. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and Margaret found herself giving impromptu interviews while still sitting in her garden, the bulldozer looming behind her like a defeated monument to bureaucratic overreach. The climax came when a representative from the State Department of Commerce arrived on scene. Margaret's complaint from months earlier had triggered a formal investigation, and the public nature of the day's events had prompted the department to accelerate their timeline. The investigator spent an hour reviewing Margaret as evidence and interviewing witnesses before making an announcement that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. The state was immediately suspending the HOA board's authority pending a full audit of their financial records and governance practices. All enforcement actions were frozen, all pending fines were suspended, and all contracts entered into without proper authorization would be reviewed for potential criminal referral. Richard Blackstone's reign of terror was over. But Margaret's victory was just beginning, because the investigation that followed would expose corruption that went far beyond what anyone had imagined. The aftermath of what local media dubbed the Garden Uprising moved swiftly and decisively. Within 48 hours of Margaret's bulldozer sit-in, Richard Blackstone had resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on family priorities. But his troubles were just beginning. The state's audit of Willowbrook Estates HOA revealed a web of financial improprieties that shocked even seasoned investigators. Over the course of Blackstone's presidency, more than $180,000 in homeowner dues had been diverted to companies with direct connections to his business network. The inflated contracts, unauthorized expenditures, and outright theft of funds painted a picture of systematic corruption that had been flying under the radar for nearly 3 years. But the financial crimes were just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Blackstone had been using his position to gather intelligence for his development projects, including accessing private property information, utility records, and even personal financial data of homeowners he was targeting for acquisition. Margaret's meticulous documentation proved invaluable to the criminal investigation that followed. The evidence she'd gathered, from the falsified meeting minutes to the shell company payments, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case against not just Blackstone, but 2 other board members who had been complicit in the scheme. The legal consequences were swift and severe. Blackstone was charged with multiple felonies including embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. His development company faced civil racketeering charges that ultimately forced it into bankruptcy. The other 2 board members accepted plea deals that included full restitution and prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership role. But for Margaret, the personal vindication was even more satisfying than the legal justice. The state's investigation completely exonerated her property management practices and ruled that every single violation notice she'd received was either factually baseless or procedurally invalid. The accumulated fines of over $12,000 were not just waived. The HOA was ordered to pay her damages for the harassment and legal costs she'd incurred. The garden that Blackstone had tried to destroy became a symbol of resistance that inspired homeowners across the region. Margaret began receiving letters and emails from people dealing with similar HOA abuses, seeking advice on how to fight back against corrupt boards and overzealous enforcement. She discovered that her story had resonated far beyond her own neighborhood, tapping into widespread frustration with HOA overreach and abuse of power. The ripple effects extended throughout the local real estate development community as well. Blackstone's criminal conviction and the publicity surrounding his schemes made other developers more cautious about using questionable tactics to acquire properties or manipulate local governance for personal gain. Several pending development projects in the area faced increased scrutiny from both regulators and community groups who had been emboldened by Margaret's successful resistance. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the reform of HOA governance practices that Margaret's case helped inspire. The state legislature, responding to public outrage over the Willowbrook scandal, passed new regulations requiring greater transparency in HOA operations, stricter oversight of financial management, and enhanced rights for homeowners facing enforcement action. The new laws included provisions that Margaret had specifically advocated for during her testimony to legislative committees. HOAs would now be required to provide detailed financial disclosures to members upon request. Board meetings would have to be recorded and transcripts made available. Most importantly, homeowners would have the right to independent arbitration before liens could be placed on their properties for alleged violations. Margaret's garden, meanwhile, became something of a tourist attraction. The heritage roses that Blackstone had tried to bulldoze bloomed more beautifully than ever, and Margaret began offering informal tours to visitors who wanted to see the site where one determined homeowner had taken on a corrupt system and won. The new HOA board, elected in a special meeting after the corruption scandal broke, took a dramatically different approach to community governance. They implemented transparent budgeting processes, established clear procedures for handling complaints, and created a community advisory committee to ensure that residents' voices were heard in all major decisions. Property values in Willowbrook Estates, which Blackstone had claimed were being harmed by Margaret's non-conforming garden, actually increased in the aftermath of the scandal. Prospective buyers were attracted to a neighborhood that had demonstrated its ability to hold corrupt leadership accountable and protect residents' rights. Margaret herself became something of a local celebrity and was frequently invited to speak at community meetings and homeowner association conferences. Her message was simple but powerful. Individual homeowners have more power than they realize, but only if they're willing to stand up for their rights and do the hard work of holding their leaders accountable. The legal precedent set by Margaret's case also had lasting implications for HOA law throughout the state. Her successful challenge to falsified meeting minutes established new standards for record-keeping and transparency. Her documentation of the connection between enforcement actions and personal financial interests created precedent for identifying and prosecuting conflicts of interest in HOA governance. 3 years later, as Margaret tends to her thriving garden and reflects on the battle that transformed her quiet neighborhood, she often thinks about the lessons learned from her confrontation with corruption and abuse of power. The most important lesson, she believes, is that bullies in positions of authority count on their victims being too intimidated, too tired, or too isolated to fight back effectively. Blackstone's entire scheme depended on individual homeowners accepting his authority without question and being afraid to challenge his increasingly outrageous demands. But Margaret also learned that fighting corruption requires more than just courage. It requires patience, preparation, and an absolute commitment to documentation and evidence. Her victory wasn't achieved through dramatic confrontation alone, but through months of careful research, meticulous record-keeping, and building relationships with others who shared her concerns. The garden that started this whole saga continues to flourish, now protected not just by property law, but by the community support Margaret cultivated during her fight. The heritage roses bloom each spring as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, and that even the most determined corruption can be defeated by someone who refuses to back down. Looking back, Margaret sometimes wonders what would have happened if she'd simply accepted that first violation notice and quietly removed the plants that Blackstone found objectionable. Would he have been satisfied with that victory, or would he have continued escalating his demands until he'd acquired everything he wanted? She's convinced that giving in to the first unreasonable demand would have only encouraged more aggressive tactics. Bullies, she learned, are rarely satisfied with partial victories. They keep pushing until they encounter real resistance. Margaret's story serves as a powerful reminder that homeowners associations, despite their mundane appearance and bureaucratic procedures, wield significant power over people's lives and property. That power can be used responsibly to maintain community standards and resolve disputes fairly. Or it can be abused by individuals who see HOA leadership as an opportunity for personal enrichment and control. The key to preventing abuse, Margaret believes, is active participation by ordinary homeowners who take the time to understand their rights, stay informed about their association's activities, and speak up when they see problems developing. Corruption thrives in darkness and silence. It withers when exposed to sunlight and community scrutiny. Today, as Margaret walks through her garden in the early morning light, tending to roses that have survived for 6 generations and will hopefully survive for many more, she reflects on a simple truth that her battle with the HOA taught her. Sometimes, the most important fights are the ones that seem smallest to outside observers but mean everything to the people directly affected. Her garden was never just about plants and flowers. It was about family legacy, community character, and the fundamental right of homeowners to enjoy their property without harassment from corrupt officials. By refusing to surrender those principles, Margaret didn't just save her own garden. She helped preserve those rights for countless other homeowners who will never know her name, but will benefit from the precedent she established. The bulldozer that once threatened to destroy Margaret's heritage roses has long since been returned to its owner. But the lesson it represents, that determined individuals can stand up to institutional corruption and win, continues to inspire people facing similar battles across the country. As Margaret often tells the visitors who come to see her famous garden, the most beautiful flowers are often the ones that grow in the most challenging conditions. Sometimes you have to fight for the right to bloom. What do you think? Have you ever dealt with an HOA that overstepped its bounds? Share your experiences in the comments below and let me know if you think Margaret's approach would work in your situation. And if this story inspired you to take action against corruption in your own community, I'd love to hear about it.